everyone, welcome back. Wow, you really went all out this time with all this stuff on Mark Carney. Articles, social media threads, even some Wikipedia deep dives.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Looks like you're interested in more than just the headlines. I mean, especially with someone like Carney, whose path is anything but typical.
Yeah, no kidding.
And, our listeners, they really love getting the full picture quickly but thoroughly. And, with someone as complex as Carney, I mean, having an expert help us through all this is, well, essential.
Absolutely. It's a really exciting time to be following Canadian politics.
Yeah, no doubt. So to help us make sense of all this, we've got our resident expert on all things Canada, politics, economics, you name it.
It's my thing.
Today we're going to explore Carney, the person, Carney, the politician, and what his vision for Canada could mean, especially considering, well, the interesting global landscape we're in right now.
Yeah, it's certainly a unique moment in history for sure.
Okay, so let's dive in. First, can we talk about this guy's backstory? It's not your typical climb up the political ladder.
Yep.
Born in Fort Smith, Northwest Territories. That's going to be a world away from Ottawa, right?
Oh, yeah. Fort Smith is about as far from the Ottawa bubble as you can get. Small town in a remote part of Canada. Not exactly the typical breeding ground for someone who ends up leading two of the world's biggest central banks.
And that's what makes it so interesting, right? We're not talking about some political dynasty here. From the Northwest Territories to Harvard, then Oxford, even rooming with a future NHL general manager playing goalie himself. It's like he was collecting achievements before he even thought about politics.
Do you think growing up in such a unique environment, do you think that shaped his worldview in a way that might make him a different kind of leader?
It's certainly possible. That blend of small-town roots and global experience it's pretty rare in Canadian politics, which has, traditionally been dominated by people from more established urban backgrounds. He definitely brings a different perspective.
Okay, hold on. Okay, I have to bring this up. Did you know his wife, Diana Fox Carney, she's an environmental economist, activist.
And get this, she's publicly criticized the banking industry, which, is where her husband built his career. I can only imagine those dinner conversations.
Yeah, I bet. It's an interesting dynamic for sure. It suggests a household where open dialogue and the ability to, navigate potentially conflicting viewpoints is encouraged. And those qualities, particularly in a political landscape as complex as ours, could be invaluable.
Right. And this intellectual curiosity seems to run deep with him. But then things get really intense. We're talking 2008, the financial crisis is hitting hard, and Carney is at the helm of the Bank of Canada.
Wow.
Then, bam, he's off to lead the Bank of England, navigating Brexit and the early days of the pandemic. Talk about trial by fire.
Yeah, no kidding. Those weren't just high-pressure jobs. He was steering two major economies through incredibly turbulent times. And don't forget, he also chaired the Financial Stability Board, the global banking watchdog. This wasn't just about economic theory. This was making decisions with, real-world consequences for millions of people.
And from what I'm seeing, he was pretty good at it, earning global recognition for his leadership through those crises. What does that tell us about him? It seems like he's not afraid of making tough calls, especially under pressure. Which brings us to, well, the current state of affairs.
Yeah, the global landscape has certainly shifted since then.
Understatement of the year. Remember when Trump slapped those tariffs on Canadian goods? And then those off-the-cuff comments about Canada becoming part of the U.S. Canadians were, to put it lightly, not thrilled.
You think. It was a big deal, for sure. I mean, the context here is crucial. Trump's aggressive America First policies, coupled with those annexation comments, created a real sense of vulnerability among Canadians. It wasn't just about the economics. It felt like an attack on their identity, and their sovereignty.
Totally, and you can see that reflected in all the social media chatter. There's this undercurrent of anxiety, a feeling that Canada needs a leader who can stand up to that kind of pressure, someone who won't be pushed around.
Absolutely. And that sentiment was really amplified by the timing of Trudeau's resignation. It created this leadership vacuum at a time when the country really needed a steady hand. Enter Mark Carney.
Right. It's almost like the stage was set for someone with his experience, his temperament. But he's not just writing on his resume, right? He's coming in with some pretty big ideas for Canada.
Oh, yeah. He's laid out an ambitious vision, and it seems to be resonating with a large segment of the population.
Okay, so let's break that vision down. From his speeches, his campaign platform, he's emphasizing economic growth, job creation, attracting investment, all pretty standard stuff, right?
Yeah, but there's a nuance to it. He's not just focused on broad economic indicators.
Yeah.
He's talking about tackling issues that directly impact people's lives. Things like, the housing crisis, the rising cost of living, and access to healthcare. He's connecting with voters on a personal level.
And he's not shying away from climate action either. In fact, he's been really vocal about it. He even served as the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance. It's not just talk. He has real credentials on this issue.
Oh, yeah. Climate change is a defining issue of our time. And Carney's experience on the global stage gives him a really unique perspective on how Canada can be a leader in the transition to, a clean energy future.
But here's where it gets interesting. He's also pushing for a more assertive stance toward the U.S. A balance of cooperation, yes, but also a willingness to, defend Canadian interests. Seems like the days of nice guy Canada might be over.
Yeah, it's a tricky balancing act. He's acknowledging that Canada can't just be a passive player on the world stage, especially with a neighbor like the U.S. He's trying to project strength without jeopardizing important economic ties.
And speaking of bold moves, did you see this? Right out of the gate, he announces he's getting rid of the consumer carbon tax and reversing that capital gains tax hike. Two policies that were not very popular with certain segments of the population. What do you make of that?
Yeah, that was surprising, especially given, his stance on climate action. Some people see it as a betrayal. Others view it as a pragmatic step towards, building consensus and addressing some of those economic concerns. It's too early to say what the long-term impact's going to be.
Well, one thing's for sure. This guy isn't afraid to shake things up. He's a complex figure with a fascinating background and a bold vision for Canada. But as we've seen, the world is anything but predictable right now. How will he navigate these, turbulent waters?
That's the question. That's the question we're going to explore further.
We'll be right back. Stay tuned for more on Mark Carney and what his leadership could mean for Canada.
And we're back. I have to say I'm still thinking about Carney's decision to scrap the consumer carbon tax and reverse that capital gains tax hike. On the one hand, it seems like a bold move, right, to address some of those economic worries people have. But then again, how does that, square with his commitment to climate action?
It's a question a lot of people are asking, that's for sure. And it really highlights the balancing act he's going to have to pull off, balancing environmental concerns with economic realities, especially in a country as diverse as Canada.
Because it's not just about optics, is it? These decisions, they have, real-world consequences. I'm curious, from your perspective, what's the overall sentiment about these moves? Is it as divided as it seems? There's definitely a mixed bag of reactions out there. Some people see it as a, pragmatic move to unify the country and get the economy going again, especially those folks who felt like that carbon tax was really hurting them.
Yeah.
But then others see it as a sign that he might put economic growth ahead of environmental concerns, and they're worried about that.
It's almost like people are seeing what they want to see based on their own priorities. Some see a decisive leader, others see, a sellout. It seems like his background as a financier is being viewed with suspicion by some. Like he's more aligned with, big corporations than with everyday Canadians.
Yeah, that outsider label is something he's going to have to, deal with carefully. He's up against a lot of deeply ingrained perceptions of politicians as being out of touch with the average person. And in a world where, people are really worried about their finances, that perception could be tough to change.
For sure, especially with the U.S. right there on our border. We talked about Trump's policies, his rhetoric, and the impact that had, on Canadians. It feels like that anxiety hasn't gone away.
No, it hasn't. And figuring out how to deal with the U.S., that relationship, it's going to be a major challenge for Carney. It's a tough balancing act. Maintaining strong economic ties, but also standing up to policies that are bad for Canada.
Feels like there's a lot of pressure to get it right. Canadians want someone who will stand up for their values, but also, protect their jobs, their livelihoods. How does Carney's experience, how does that prepare him for that kind of high-stakes diplomacy?
Well, his background in international finance, that definitely gives him a unique advantage. I mean, he understands how the global economy works in a way that most politicians don't. He's negotiated with world leaders. He's handled crises. He knows how to play the game, so to speak, on a global level.
So it's not just about being tough. It's about being, smart about it.
Exactly. It's about understanding power, where the pressure points are, the potential consequences, knowing when to hold firm and when to compromise.
Which brings us to the challenges he's facing within Canada itself. It's a huge and diverse country with different regions having different priorities. How do you unify a country that seems, well, increasingly divided?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's not just about policy. It's about communication. It's about, building trust,
Mm.
showing Canadians that he understands their concerns, that he's working for everybody, not just a select few.
He needs to convince those folks who see him as an elitist, an outsider, that he's actually on their side.
Exactly. And that's where his, lack of a traditional political background, that could be a hurdle. He doesn't have those deep networks, those long-standing relationships that a lot of politicians rely on.
Yeah.
He's going to have to build those from scratch.
So it's not just about what he does, it's about how he does it. It's about style as much as substance.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He needs to connect with people on a personal level, demonstrate empathy, show that he's listening. He can't just be a technocrat dictating policy. He has to be a leader who inspires, who motivates, who brings people together.
And he has to do it quickly. The clock is ticking. The next election is coming up, and he's got to convince Canadians he's the right person to lead them through these uncertain times.
He's definitely got his work cut out for him, that's for sure.
And speaking of work, let's talk about his team. Who is he surrounding himself with? Who are the key players in his inner circle?
Ooh, that's the subject of a lot of speculation right now. Some people think he'll stick with experienced players like, Chrystia Freeland. A lot of folks see her as a natural successor to Trudeau. She brings a ton of experience and a strong international reputation.
Freeland's name keeps popping up in these articles. She's definitely a force to be reckoned with.
For sure. But there are also, whispers that Carney might shake things up a bit, bring in some fresh faces from outside the usual political circles, people from business, from academia, from different parts of society.
That would definitely send a message that he's serious about doing things differently. A break from the status quo, a willingness to embrace new ideas, new perspectives.
It's risky, but it could also be, really smart. It could energize his base, attract new supporters, and signal that he's really committed to building a more inclusive government, one that represents more people.
So we've got a potential cabinet shakeup, a new approach to dealing with the U.S., and a leader who's not afraid to make bold moves. Canadian politics just got a lot more interesting.
Definitely, to say the least.
But the big question is, will it work? Will it be effective?
That's the question we're all waiting to see answered.
We'll be right back after a quick break. Stay tuned for more on Mark Carney and the future of Canada. All right, we're back, and it's time to, get down to the nitty-gritty. We've talked about Carney's background, his political moves, the whole global situation. But what does his vision for a stronger Canada actually mean for people, for their everyday lives?
Yeah, this is where those big ideas have to turn into, actual action. And one of the biggest issues he's promised to tackle is the housing crisis. I mean, it feels like everyone's feeling the squeeze, right? Rising rents, property values going through the roof.
It's definitely on a lot of people's minds. What's Carney's plan here? What's he going to do?
Well, he's talking about a multi-pronged approach. On the supply side, he wants to increase the availability of affordable housing, which means, a lot of investment working with provinces and cities. He's also looking at ways to kind of curb speculation, which a lot of people say is artificially driving up those prices.
So tackling it from both sides, the supply and demand, makes sense. But how does his background in finance, how does that play into this?
That's where things get really interesting. He's hinted at using, financial tools, incentives to encourage more construction of affordable housing, maybe through, tax breaks or special loan programs. He's also talked about regulations to kind of limit foreign investment in real estate, which some argue is a big factor in those sky-high prices.
So it sounds like he's bringing a more market-based approach to a problem that's usually been handled through social policy. But, I mean, these things, they don't happen overnight, do they?
Oh, no, absolutely not.
Yeah.
The housing crisis is complicated. It's got deep roots, and it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of collaboration to really make a difference. But I think people are hoping that someone who, gets the financial system can bring some new ideas to the table.
Yeah. It's a big one, that's for sure. A make-or-break issue for a lot of voters. And then there's healthcare, another, cornerstone of being Canadian. But it always seems to need, attention.
Healthcare is always a hot topic.
Yeah.
And it's facing some big challenges, long wait times, rising costs, an aging population. It's a lot to handle.
And Carney says he wants to to strengthen the system, but what does that actually mean? What's he going to do?
He's talked about a few key things. First, investing in technology, innovation to make
Mm.
the system more efficient, easier to access. Second, he's promised to work towards a national pharmacare program,
Right.
which would be a huge change in how Canadians get their prescription drugs.
National pharmacare, that's been debated for years. What would be the impact if he actually, made it happen?
It could be huge. I mean, millions of Canadians struggle to pay for their medication,
Yeah.
right? A national program could make a real difference in their lives. But it's a massive undertaking. It would mean, complicated negotiations with the provinces, a big financial commitment.
Sounds like he's not afraid to tackle the big stuff, even if it's, politically risky. And of course, we can't talk about Carney without talking about climate change.
Right. It's the issue of our time, and it's already having a real impact on Canada. More extreme weather, rising sea levels, glaciers melting. It's not just an environmental problem anymore. It affects our economy, our society.
And Carney seems to get that. I mean, he's positioned himself as a climate leader, and he has already made some pretty bold moves.
Yeah, beyond the carbon tax thing we talked about, he's also proposed this carbon border adjustment, basically putting a price on imports that have a big carbon footprint. It's a way to make things fair for Canadian businesses and hopefully push other countries to do their part on climate action.
So he's not just focused on what Canada's doing. He's trying to influence what's happening globally.
He seems to understand that climate change is a global problem and it needs a global solution. And he's using his experience, his connections, to try to make Canada a leader in that effort.
He's even talked about Canada becoming a clean energy superpower. What does that even look like?
Well, he sees a future where Canada uses its natural resources, its potential for renewable energy to become, a global leader in clean energy, investing in new technologies, creating jobs, attracting investment in those clean energy sectors.
That's a big vision, but it seems more and more realistic as the world shifts away from fossil fuels. It's like he's trying to position Canada to succeed in a changing world.
That's exactly it. He's not just thinking about today. He's looking ahead, trying to anticipate the challenges, the opportunities, and make sure Canada can thrive.
But let's be real, it's not all about economics and being a global player. There are real social issues that need to be addressed.
Absolutely. And he has talked about the need for a more inclusive, more equitable Canada,
Yeah.
addressing things like systemic racism, gender inequality, reconciliation with Indigenous peoples.
Those are issues that haven't always been front and center in Canadian politics. What makes you think he's, serious about tackling them?
It's still early, of course. But he seems to understand that a strong Canada, a prosperous Canada, is one where everyone has a chance to succeed, no matter who they are, where they come from. He's made it clear that these issues aren't just, the right thing to do. They're essential for Canada's future, both economically and socially.
So he's trying to paint a picture of Canada that's ambitious and compassionate. But the big question is, can he actually do it? Can he deliver?
That's what we're all waiting to see. He's set a high bar for himself, and the whole world's watching.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? What should they be paying attention to as Carney's story unfolds?
I think the most important thing is to look beyond the headlines. Really think about the choices he makes, the impact those choices will have on Canada's future.
It's about being informed, being part of the conversation, and holding our leaders accountable.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, the future of Canada is something we all share.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with something to think about. Mark Carney is stepping onto the world stage at a time of, huge change and uncertainty. Can he handle it? Can he lead Canada to a brighter future? That's for you to decide.
Keep digging into those sources, stay engaged, and most importantly, make your voice heard.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious.